There's people that podcast for purpose and for passion, and there's people that podcast out of fear. And I gotta say that it's actually quite telling when you're podcasting out of fear. And if you don't think that is telling, you'll probably start noticing after listening to this episode, because I'm gonna cover 10 signs that actually show if you're podcasting out of fear. My name is Anna Xavier, and this is The Podcast Space, a practical podcast to get you unstuck and elevate your show. Let's go. If you're watching this on YouTube, you already can tell what's happening here. But if you're listening, well, I decided to make the set today, and I'm calling it the set, it is my office, but I decided to give it a little bit of a darker mood, a darker vibe, and get it a little more intimate, because I think that when you're podcasting out of fear, everything feels really scary and it's not really clear why you're podcasting. It feels also that there's kind of like things coming out of all corners, like competition is out to get you. And this show is to kind of get you in the mood and get focused and get clarity. And hopefully at the end of this episode, you would have felt lighter and kind of like with an illuminated path. So we're going right to the first one. And this is something that, in my experience working with podcasters from pretty much all countries, all sides of the world, all levels of expertise and experience, this is just such a common one. And that is to record an episode until the show is quote unquote perfect. And if you are just tuning into the show for the first time, you probably feel like what do you mean perfect? Of course I want to create perfect content, and I obviously want to create and deliver amazing stuff. Well, I want to tell you that there's the difference between creating perfect content and creating content that is good enough. And perfect content kind of shows up in a way that you feel like nothing you create is ever good enough. You feel like you're crafting episodes, you're rewriting the script, you're constantly re-recording because you said one thing wrong, or potentially you just didn't like the angle. You're often telling your podcast producer to scrap that or to re-upload a new episode. And it's just coming from a place of fear. And the reality for at least the clients that I work with, I love setting up the expectation that, again, it is true for some people that you really want to be, of course, if it's like a factual and science podcast, you have to be, sure that you're conveying the right information. But for most people, your podcast is for people who are not as knowledgeable as you. And so you don't need to set up that expectation of creating perfect content. If anything, imperfect content with a few ums and ahs, it will humanize your brand. In fact, I do that in this podcast to show you that I create content that is valuable, but at the same time, it's not perfect, right? Like, you're not getting hung up on the fact that I say every now and again, right? So number 2 is thinking that you have to impress your peers and spending an insane amount of energy really crafting the perfect promo. It kind of like really goes hand in hand. And that is to really like making sure that you covered all bases, that you explained all the things. And that really disconnects the listener if they're not that knowledgeable, because it feels like you're talking over their head and you want to talk directly to their face. And so you have to be really careful of that and start noticing, like, when you're creating content, when you're publishing your episode, are you thinking about that one peer that kind of judged you earlier in your career, or that said something nasty to you, or just, sometimes people just are rude because they don't have the confidence to start their show, and so they kind of crap on other people's. So sometimes that happens. And then that also is really, like, I feel like every single item of this episode in a way is really neatly together, and that is using language that is far too advanced for the listener. And when I'm doing podcast audits, that is one of the things that I talk to clients about, or even on podcast power hours. We kind of like go through what the goals of the client are, right? Like, the podcaster is trying to reach this type of people. this is what they are. And then I listen to the show. And most times when someone is coming from a place of fear, the whole show is covering language that has way too many acronyms. I worked with a client one time where I was like, I literally have no idea what you're covering. And you're supposed to target people like me who are small business owners. And it was a come to Jesus moment for him, because he was like, what do you mean they're not like common words? I'm like, well, for me personally, they aren't. I don't know what these means. How about you go and do a kind of market research and talk to your listeners? And in fact, he realized, and he thought he was providing so much insightful information. And so if you're someone who uses a lot of acronyms, always make sure that after the acronym, you say what the word is, just in case. It's a way to also cement your expertise with your listeners, right? Without kind of like pushing them away. And then number 4 is putting on a show as a persona. And someone who actually worked in radio, for me, I can really tell when someone is trying to put on an act. And again, because obviously, especially in commercial radio, you have a lot of people who have big personalities. But I mean, if I was constantly talking to you like this, you would probably be like, that's not Anna, like, she's weird, right? Like, what the hell? And so I want to remind you, like, people make business with people, and people don't expect you to be a radio host. They expect you to be someone who is knowledgeable in the industry. Would you have a normal conversation like that? No, probably not. So that's just the same thing. And then sharing too little of their podcast. So this is another one that comes from a place of fear, and that is like thinking, if I share too much on my podcast, then people are not going to hire me to do, like whatever I do. Think about it like that. When you're talking to someone and they literally are constantly evading the question, never going in depth, it's really hard to gauge if they're the person who you want to do business with, but also at the same time, like, you really cannot gauge if they know what they're talking about. And I can talk about from experience on social media, and I just launched the podcast. If you're watching this in kind of like real-time launch, this is the episode number 10. And so I have been getting students for my courses, for my podcast consulting work through social media, through the podcast. And that has been because I have been sharing what I know very thoroughly. So people do know when they are coming to me, they know that I am the right person to work with them. Also, that I have the type of personality that aligns with the type of work they're trying to do, and that I understand the type of person that they are. So don't be afraid to share too much, because if anything, you're just telling and confirming, are you the right person for me, right? And then also, like, when you're talking too much on each episode, like, that's the opposite, right? And I hear and I work with podcasters who would do like, an episode that was like 45 minutes long, but I only was able to retain, or like the listeners would only be able to retain pretty much like 15%, because the episode was so complex that it was just really hard to follow along. And with our short attention spans, you have to consider if that information would be better suited to be crafted on a mini episode or a shorter episode, or maybe something that you do an exercise with someone else. And that's something that shows up when someone is coming from a place of fear, and that is that, like, you have to over explain everything, otherwise people are not either going to get it, or that people are not going to perceive you as a thought leader or knowledgeable. So there's ways to do it, but if you have to literally explain from A to Z all the time, constantly, in depth, it's not going to work out. Also because we already know from stats released by Edison Research that people are multitasking. People are driving when they're listening to podcasts. People are doing chores. They're using the podcast to keep them company. So their concentration, their focus is fragmented. And that means that, like, they're not going to be able to focus like the longest thread in the world that you're like taking us through, right? And then number 7 is never talking about the products and services that you actually have in your business. And that is like connected to fear, because you're afraid that if you talk about your products and services, people are going to stop listening to your content, or people are going to find you salesy. And while I love educating people, I have to remind myself that I have to pay the bills. I have to obviously make money with this business because this is not a hobby. And so sharing the transformation of people that I help on the show, right? Like talking about how the things that we work together help them get to the point that we're hoping to get, like I was just talking about earlier on the show, is giving people the awareness that you are doing business and you are open for business. And so obviously if they don't want to do business with you, they just won't, but it's still useful to know that you're in business, right? I've listened to podcasts for years. One of them, Amy Porterfield, I listened to Amy's podcast for about like 2 years before I even bought her course. Granted, it was over $2,000 course, but again, when I was ready, I bought from her and it didn't bother me that she was promoting her course all the time, right? So just think about that. And then obviously talking about that multitasking level, right? Like forgetting that people are multitasking and just constantly barraging them with information. Like that is something that your listeners will feel super overwhelmed because you're just constantly telling them all the things all the time in order to make sure like you're giving them numbers and percentages and really complex processes. And it's just like, can I give you my full focus for 45 minutes? Or 2 hours? That's when you have to realize, like, am I coming from a place of fear? Then number 9 is only inviting people from your network to the show. I've talked about how podcasts are amazing tools for networking with decision makers in your industry to make new acquaintances, to broaden just your network and your net worth. But at the same time, when you're coming from a place of fear, you feel like your content isn't good enough. And therefore, you only invite people who you already know or who are very familiar to your brand to come on the show. Also, people that, like, on that same breath, I'm like, people who have, like, dream guests and never email them. People who would be amazing and who'd probably say yes to being guests on the show. They never email them because they just are so afraid of being perceived as someone who maybe is not going to be up to the standard. They're not going to deliver good value, or just honestly, sometimes it's just potential of someone saying no just freezes them completely. So I want to invite you to not think like that. And then number 10, it is spending too much time editing and literally removing every extra breath, every mistake, and then leads you to not having enough energy promoting the podcast. And we already know that podcasts are not great for discoverability. So if you're spending 2 hours on editing the show, but then you're promoting the podcast once and kind of like at odd hours and the promo is put together literally, hey, listen to the show, you're not going to grow the show. So I want to invite you to put more effort into, maybe practicing ahead of the show instead of like spending all the time in post-production. But also, I think at the end of the day, all of these can be removed. All of the fears that I just mentioned can be removed if you take the focus out of yourself, out of the ego, and put it into the value they're giving your community. Because that's when I think real transformation happens. And I talk about this with my podcasters all the time. We all suffer from imposter syndrome, but not letting it rule our choices when it's time for, publishing the episode, or just the energy that we're devoting to things, or not emailing people because we're too afraid of like being told no. So where are you putting your fear? Where are you putting your belief? I want you to just focus on your community, and that will really help you shift the perception of value that you're creating, and to create and step into a new stage of podcast content creation. And so if this is something that you feel like you really want to dive deeper, I created a podcast course called Maximize Your Podcast Content. And I break down exactly like how to create better content in ways that helps you manage your energy, and also how you can maximize your influence through this content itself. Because honestly, when we are in a fear-based space, we're kind of like in action. And when we're doing the action, when we are committing to creating content and being present, we're absolutely creating change. And so I want to invite you to check out the course. I'll have the links in the description below. But at the same time, I want to know, what was your biggest aha? You can always tag me on Instagram because that's where I am. I'm at the podcast space. And all the resources mentioned in this episode and more, because sometimes I forget to talk about things, will be at thepodcastspace.com/podcast. And you can find the latest episode over there. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day. Keep creating content that is imperfect, but moves you forward. Have a great week.